So hello everyone, it's so very nice to be back. We had a little bit of a break. I hope everybody get at least some rest or a little bit of disconnecting, whether it was raining, sunny, short or long. But it's definitely nice to be back with our conversations. It's incredible how fast the time goes. But yes, so today we're gonna focus a little bit on fashion curation. I would just like to start with a brief introduction. So for those who haven't joined us or are joining us for the first time, so usually we start about 30 minutes to reflect on the reading with the author of the reading, which in this case is going to be Erica de Greef, who's also one of the conveners of the conversations. And she will be joined by Amanda Maples. So she is, let me see, a curator of African art at the North Carolina Museum of Art and Research and database coordinator of the Digital Benin Project. So she has written essays, books, and articles, and curated a range of exhibitions on historical and contemporary African arts, museum policies, and ethical collection practices. So she's the guest curator and author of Good as Gold, Fashioning Senegalese Women, the first in-depth scholarly exploration of Senegalese gold jewelry to date. And she's also the dialogue editor of the journal African Arts and secretary of the steering committee for the Benin Dialogue Group. And she holds a PhD from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and is currently working on a new NEH-funded traveling exhibition entitled New Masks Now, Artists Innovating Masquerade in Contemporary West Africa. Wow. So thank you so much, Amanda, for joining us, in my case, this evening. And for me personally, before we start, I came across a beautiful, beautiful letter written by Fabian Barba, who is an Ecuadorian dancer and who's also part of the Decolonial Summer School. And if you would allow me, I would like to read a little passage of that beautiful letter, where he says, I have the impression that some people might understand listening as a withdrawal, as keeping their mouths shut while asking or even subtly demanding the other to speak. This listening remains unidirectional and reinforces the dichotomy self-other. This listening once again abstracts the subject who decides to listen out of any possibility of conversation, of engaging in the process of knowing each other. I have the impression that a decolonial listening has to be reciprocal. It has to be able to show ourselves to each other and host each other. If listening is a learning, we have to be ready to share what we have learned, including what we have learned or are learning about ourselves through that dialogue, unquote. I guess it stayed with me because indeed we have been talking about listening as a radical act. But I think what is so incredibly powerful in this piece is that actually listening is not necessarily being quiet. So I just wanted to share that since we are figuring our way out to with these conversations, how we can learn together, how we can create, I don't like to say new ways of creating knowledge because they're actually old ways, I would think, of creating knowledge. But let's say in our case, other ways of creating knowledge in regard to fashion. So I just wanted to share that with you. But I won't take up too much time. So with no further ado, I do want to, of course, remind everybody to be respectful of each other's journeys and be incredibly grateful, I think, to be able to have this opportunity to learn together. So Amanda, you have prepared some questions in response to the reading for Erica. And we also shared an additional reading from the Fashion Theory Journal, which is actually an interview from Cornelia Lund to Beatrice Angut. And so we might, if we have time, reflect on that as well. So Amanda, please.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the really invigorating quote. I actually also wanted to begin with a quote. So as you know, we've read this article by Erica today, and I have the great pleasure and honor, thank you so much, to introduce it and summarize it. And one of the quotes that really stood out for me and that I wanted to requote here is, "The curatorial is a powerful key to creating the conditions for decolonial work to begin." And that really stuck with me when I was reading it, and I'd already read this months ago, and so I was happy to revisit this article. And I remember thinking, this is why we do, and just getting excited about, you know, the article, all of this work that we're doing. But I think this is also why as curators of African arts and fashions, our work should start and end with African narratives and positionings. So that's something that really stuck out to me. And in the article that we've read for today, or this evening, depending on where you are, Erica focuses on one case study of a very particular pair of jeans out of 21 ensembles chosen for an exhibition entitled 21 Years, Making Histories with South African Fashion Week, and which was on view at Sites MoCA from late 2018 to early 2019. The jeans and other works that she chose offered the potential to trouble, disrupt, and rewrite histories in South African fashion, and this curatorial work is creating that powerful moment for decolonial work. So these jeans to me are a metonym for the hybridity, mutability, and the shared and overlapping yet individual nature of creativity and the migratory fluidity of contemporary and urban experience, particularly in Africa. The patchwork jeans spoke to what is in effect and in reality patchwork experiences of life. Sometimes they obscure, sometimes they overlap, sometimes they highlight, but always they are evolving and changing with the wearer and because of the physical experiences and emotional influences of the world around them. So first, I want to say that in your work, Erica, and in this article, you perform the delicate balancing act of centering African narratives, including and contributing to international scholarship, and engaging and including objects and narratives of local and community interest, all while challenging and pushing the canon further and pressing us as museum practitioners and curators to think more deeply about our practice. This helps us to conceptually widen those that voice and perform the so-called canon. You encourage us to think, does it decolonize? Am I listening? Am I including or recognizing all voices and thinking through a broader set of object possibilities, or inadvertently prioritizing some over others? Am I upending or underscoring cliches of fashion or other kinds of expectations? Your work and that of your assistant, Lasiba, really push us to reflect on who is speaking, who is welcome and heard, and who is, whether intentionally or not, rejected or denied in the building of a museum narrative. We must attend to what is absent as much as what we are making present. For me, this strikes a chord with where I think museums are at on a meta level, and presents a bold curation challenge. I remember thinking of these, some of these things you were working through as challenges to us as curators, those of us that are curating, and that I experienced in my own work and that your article laid bare. So one is how to overcome the translation of such important cultural legacies in individual objects to audiences who may not readily get their coding. Two, how to make these overlooked stories visually compelling. And three, how to attend to the emotional and personal while meeting expectations for an artful, cultural, and historic experience on a regional, national, and global level. So overall, this challenges the authorial voice, so often protected by curatorial practice and that museums too easily assume is theirs and theirs alone, and that is often taken for granted or just not reflected upon. So museums have the burden, the expectation, and the power to designate what art is and to legitimize what is shown and who is listened to. In effect, they are mirrors held up to our cultural and national identities, and in their actions are normalizing art and culture according to their own, perhaps, myths and histories. So they move away from simply reflecting and rather are instructing, or at least these are some of the pitfalls that museums have fallen into. So I also noted that you attend to a moment of recognition that viewers, visitors, artists, designers either have or don't have or experience in the museum space. And that is that moment where you either see yourself represented and visible in the museum or in the artwork, or you don't. And in your work, I think you admirably pluralized and amplified the voices represented and able to speak. And in so doing, you've pluralized the opportunity for audiences to see themselves represented. I was also struck by, as you mentioned, the pervasive binary of traditional versus modern and contemporary in African fashion and dress, and that continues to haunt it today. And see a resonance in my own work with African arts and masquerades more broadly. So most African objects are also subject to this cliche as being merely traditional, unchanging, and timeless. And I, like you, find it noteworthy the degree to which our visitors are still surprised and find their expectations of African arts and fashions disrupted and challenged. So why does this binary and this expectation of aesthetics still persist, despite all of this work that we've continuously been doing, all of us? So I hope we'll get to that in our conversations too. That was my introduction to it and some of the thoughts that I'd had while reading it and digesting it and being inspired by it, obviously. So I've framed the questions, and I don't think am I supposed to introduce you? Because okay, good, because I didn't prepare that. So they're framed in three sort of groups of questions. And the first is framed with exhibition and curatorial method or methodology. So I'm just going to fire these away if that's okay, unless you'd like to respond before I begin. That's okay? Okay. So the first framing is about exhibition and curatorial method. So one, how did you choose the designers? So was there a call or a community input? So can you share some of the other narratives that are embedded within the works included in the exhibition, but not represented in the article, and their decolonial potential? So basically, were there other works that highlighted absences or functioned as direct, indirect, or radical acts of resistance? The next one is the exhibition looks at a specific time period in South Africa. So to me, this curatorial framing was an effective tool towards locality and specificity, and thereby overturns the homogenizing effects of the museum apparatus. So I'd like to hear a bit more about how you zeroed in on this time period, why you chose that. And then, as I previously mentioned, on page 915, you cite the curatorial as a powerful key to creating the conditions for decolonial work to begin. And you speak of 3 moments of the decolonial method. So I'm kind of curious, can we extend this to a broader curatorial methodology as you've done in your work? And what would this process look like? Could there almost be a guide to decolonial curatorial practice is sort of my question, and maybe just musing for further conversation. And then lastly, can you tell us how you selected the genes, and for you, how they have disrupted fashion curation and museum narratives, and then which narratives specifically? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you. I took a moment to revisit my own writing, which is sometimes also quite an interesting place. You write these things because they move through you, and you try and get the essence of what it is that you've done and put it on paper, and then it starts to have another life beyond you. So coming back to it with a close reading, with that same sense that you had read it, and then you came back to it with a close reading, and then sort of you refine these things. So thank you so much just for sparking up a whole range of questions and ideas. And maybe just, I think that the article tried to journey together with a particular object that came out of the exhibition. So I didn't spend that much time writing about the exhibition. So you ask, so maybe just very briefly, the broader scope of the museum at the time was, we're investigating this opportunity to exhibit fashion in an art museum, in a contemporary art museum. And that moment on you know, and I'm sort of on the African continent, that moment to sort of say, we can put African fashion in an art museum, recognized for what it is as fashion, was quite a challenge on my shoulders to say, like, how do I start to even begin to represent such an enormous scope, and start somewhere. So South African Fashion Week at the time was exploring the possibilities of collating a book celebrating 21 years. So that's where the 21 years conversation started with them, and they had called designers that had showcased over the 21-year period at South African Fashion Week, and called for designers to contribute photographically from their own from ramp record, but to contribute garments that they may have responding to that ramp history. And it was from that pool of garments. So they had about, I think they had about 60 or so garments that designers still had from their own archives. So this was pulling from designers' own archives. So in that way, a really interesting, there were one or two designers who managed to locate garments that had been purchased by customers and said, can we borrow our own garment back and to show in the museum? So that pool of designers' work is what I worked with to pull, and to put an exhibition together is quite a costly exercise. So the curatorial focus to look at 21 garments and to try and tell some kind of historic journey that traced a South African fashion history from just after the new democracy, and traced a 21-year period. So these 21 garments kind of acted as touch points in that journey. And so I think the impetus to try and tell a rich story that wasn't easily decipherable. So again, in the exhibition narrative, I didn't chronologically stage them. It wasn't like, oh, well, there you've got 1989, 1990, 1991, 1992. And so I disrupted the chronology of it. So people were kind of, oh, this is from 1994. And this is 2004. And wow, look at how they communicate with one another. So it was very much about how these garments spoke to one another as well, and spoke to these histories. So the process of putting the exhibition together allowed me to negotiate with quite a wide set of my own cohort, which is a fashion industry in South Africa, and then asking the kinds of questions in my own background as a lecturer, my own background as a practitioner. And so we talk about this thing about listening quite carefully. So perhaps it was those years of listening and the kind of research that I'd done with my PhD in terms of like whose narratives are being told, what kind of narratives are being told in museums, and particularly this distinction between tradition as ethnographic and fashion as a kind of Western narrative. So these kind of subtle disruptions of blurring those boundaries, whether it's recognizing that within the designer's work themselves, and then as a curator, almost encouraging these dialogues with these objects.
You want a glass of wine? Sorry.
On the actual ramp.
Okay.
So I think you asked, I'm trying to sort of get a sense of the kind of response to this much bigger question of like, how is it that we can start to think about a decolonial method for curating. And so just drawing on Walter Mignola and Rolando Vasquez, sort of decolonial method in my work in putting the exhibition together. The first is to acknowledge that coloniality. So in this case, it was an art museum, and there were certain kinds of expectations as to what kind of fashion could engage, and this particular art museum as a international facing art museum, not necessarily a local facing art museum. So engaging with an international public and the kind of expectations of what kind of garments or what kind of fashion would be expected, appreciated, even understood. So acknowledging how coloniality was at play. And then perhaps, you know, I recognize that it is from my own work as being a lecturer and being involved in fashion education for so long. The impact of that coloniality is that there are huge absences of what isn't shown and what isn't put on the ramp. So the impact on designers around thinking about their own creative process, thinking about their own aesthetic registers or aesthetic meaning systems. So this erasure, so the impact of that coloniality on erasures and absences. And then the third part of this decolonial method is to insert more or multiple or other stories. So the opportunity that the exhibition, by framing it as 21 garments, 21 stories, kind of converged into this multiple dialogue, as opposed to the sort of singular narrative of an exhibition, which is so often taken. So I kind of took those and then selected garments that had complex and multiple stories themselves. So absolutely, whether we have the opportunity to begin to think about a decolonial method possibilities for the future. But I'll speak a little bit more about the Imblacello and how they came to be, but maybe in response to a further question. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I was just thinking with some of the things you were saying, for me, those choices in the exhibitions or in music, I love those moments where something doesn't fit. It falls into these interstices of categories, you know, like it doesn't fit in any one. It sort of blurs all of those lines and those genres. And so that's just something that came to mind as you were speaking about all that. And yeah, I do hope that we can talk about a larger guide or method. So the second frame I had of questions was around museums and museum practices. We're kind of already being led there at this point. But firstly, I noticed that you mentioned this ongoing archival violence. So I wanted to know, to what extent do you think this ongoing archival violence is still at play? Or has it changed in light of the global protests of 2020, the pandemic, other movements? And in what sense then are archives performative? And how is this exhibition related to overturning this violence? Secondly, I'm interested in how fashion is or can be a counter to those homogenizing narratives, histories, and representations by making that which is obscured more visible. So including lived experience in tangible things like memory and emotion. So how is physical wear on clothing, so visible histories of use, here different from or similar to the use value of so-called traditional African art objects that's all too often related to authenticity as described by collectors, dealers, curators of the global north. So how is it similar to the restitutions, reparations movements that are currently so urgent with regards to colonial era and looted African arts? And is this representative or indicative of a larger museum and curatorial turn, which I sort of was indicating earlier that I kind of hope we're at this juncture of larger change in how museums see themselves, what their roles are, you know, where we are, and I see those as parallel things perhaps. And then thirdly, if discussed in concert with the articulations of Beatrice Angut, is decolonizing an internal, external act, an act of museums and curators, or is it an act of the colonizers that subs as a replacement process? Because that's what Beatrice has talked about it as. So she mentions it as a preoccupation in the academic field and questions what it really means to decolonize fashion. So basically, is fashion curation then a vehicle to decolonize museums rather than to decolonize fashion per se? Is it both or neither of these? Does decolonizing center the colonial experience rather than freeing itself from it? And Angola, she suggests that deconstructing rather than decolonizing fashion might be better terminology. So those are three also kind of bulky questions that I'm going to now softball to you.
Thank you. Sure. You know, I'm aware that we're running with time as well. I think a really important point that you bring out is the way in which African art objects have been authenticated and how there's a certain kind of marking that has separated them and processed them that follows on through museum practice. And in my PhD research, it was incredibly clear how these museum practices have kept fashion objects out of the collections. So this archival practice of what gets allowed in and where. So in South Africa, any garment that may have belonged to Nelson Mandela or Miriam Makeba or Winnie Mandela or any Brenda Fassie or any kind of iconic individual whose garments would have been collected as a fashion object in other museums, in other spaces, but in South Africa, these just didn't enter into the classic art museum, which needed to be authentic and traditional. So these kind of binaries that separate, and there's this huge gap that exists in the middle, where these more hybrid objects and fashion objects, these very interesting objects that explore expression, agency, individuality, just did not enter into these collections. So this ongoing erasure, and it's not just in the museums that this erasure is happening. It is also in the curriculum, it's also in the textbooks, it's also in the public imagination, that these erasures happen, and this ongoing repetition of this. So to work into that, and that's the work that I think that we're doing by taking fashion into these spaces and using these fashion objects that carry such large amounts of agency in them. And I think that's what I was trying to do with the article is this particular pair of embellished jeans or imblacelo, how they were called into dialogue. And once we acknowledge what that object brings in terms of its histories, you start to unravel, you start to be able to read a history around individuals, around politics, around families, around struggle, around culture, around expression, around identity. So, and all of this is absent. And so this really powerful tool to be able to work with an object to start to unravel very different kinds of stories. And so in the exhibition, the fact that a designer garment that referenced an object of one of the assistant curators, and how this called into the museum a whole story that had otherwise been disavowed from the museum, and the surprise, as I sort of mentioned in the article, the kind of surprise that this is something that that is surprising even 20 something odd years after the end of apartheid. And as you say, that the you know, is there a shift? Is there a move to kind of, you know, start to acknowledge the kind of violence that fashion exhibitions, art exhibitions, museums enact on other cultures? So I do want to go on to Beatrice and Cornelia's point, but maybe it's something we could look at in
when we come back.
Yeah, so I'm quite happy to hold that point, because I know that Angela, you also wanted to maybe contribute to that as a response to, because I recognize that that's also a point. Yeah,
I think it'd be good if we can take it with us in the breakout rooms, and then we can bring it all back when we come back to the group. Yeah, is that an idea?
Yep, I'm good with that.
Shayna, if you can all send us magically to